everyone. Welcome back to the Practical Theism podcast, where culture and faith go hand in hand. This is the place where we dive into how religious thought marries together with how people operate. And today on the podcast, I'm really excited. I got another friend of mine, Dave Brunsman, out of Cincinnati, Ohio. Dave's a RCIA director for his local parish. He's married with 4 kids, and he's been studying theology at the local seminary, and he's kind of a theology nut. He's probably one of the smartest lay people I know. So he was raised Catholic. He walked away for about 20 years, asking all the tough questions, really, and kind of came back during his wife's conversion in a pretty radical way. And so he's a wealth of information. I just want to take a minute to welcome you, Dave Brunsman, to the Practical Theism podcast. Welcome.
I appreciate the intro. Thanks, Josh. It's good to see you, man.
It's good to see you too, man. It's fun with these Zoom calls for the podcast. We could be miles and miles away and still be so close.
No doubt. No doubt about it.
Well, you know, I gave kind of like a really quick speed pitch of your journey up until this point. I don't know if there's anything you might potentially want to add that, about your conversion or reversion, I guess I should say, and just diving into a lot of those tough questions. Give people a little bit of context about where you came from.
Yeah, I think my revision, I think you were right. It was a really radical reversion back to the faith. My wife was raised Methodist, and I kind of pushed her and said, hey, you said you were going to take RCIA. It took 10 years after our marriage that she actually walked into the room. And really at that point on, it was just, we left every week and we were just asking these questions like, okay, so what was said in your RCIA class, was that true? And if it's true, like, what's the consequence of it? And so we really, for a whole year, just asked every question we could possibly come up with, and anything we heard, we challenged it. And it was just kind of through that process that I realized that, before I knew that my wife was going to convert, I realized I was in big trouble because I knew that I was Catholic all the way through and through, and I'm waiting for her to convert and didn't know if she was going to or not. And, praise God she did.
Yeah.
But
that's incredible. Well, for everybody listening right now, you're in for a real treat because Dave and I over the years have had some really just, I don't know if deep is the word, deep conversations about a lot of these faith topics. And Dave's got such a great way of looking at things. And my mind's eye, I always ask question after question after question. And Dave's been super patient with me as I've been picking his brain about a lot of this stuff. So I'm really excited to have him on here. And actually, Dave's conversion story is very similar to a lot of people when it comes to going out of Catholicism, coming back in. Catholicism, obviously one of the biggest organized religions. So many people are baptized Catholic, and they may or may not even be aware that they've been baptized Catholic, and they're walking around as a Catholic in the world, but just not really engaged with their faith. And so it's a pretty common story, and we're going to dive into that topic today, specifically why people are leaving Christianity, just kind of on a broad scale here. So we're going to start with that question. Dave, in a Pew Research Center telephone surveys conducted in 2018 and 2019, 65% of American adults describe themselves as Christians when they talk about religion. And that's down 12 percentage points over the past decade. And currently, 43% of U.S. adults identify with Protestantism, which is down from 51% in 2009. And 1 in 5 adults, so 20% are Catholic, down from 23% in 2009. Meanwhile, all the subsets of the religiously unaffiliated, as we'll call them, that population, and this is a growing group known as the nuns. They don't have any claim to any religious affiliation. We've seen their numbers kind of increase and swell. Self-described atheists now account for 4% of U.S. adults, up modestly from a significant from like 2% in 2009. Agnostics makes up 5%, up 3% from 10 years ago. And 26% of Americans now describe their religion as, well, nothing in particular, up 12% from 2009. So we're seeing this kind of shift in the tides. And this is a problem, not just for Catholics and for Catholicism. This is Christianity kind of across the board. So why do you think we are seeing such a surge of Christians leave Christianity?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because as I reflect on this a little bit more, I was one of those groups, leaving the church. I wouldn't say I was bordering on atheism, but I was definitely a hard agnostic and asking those questions and just, is there even a God? Does this even matter if there is one?
Yeah.
So really, I think that this is a multifaceted problem that doesn't have a really good, easy answer, but I'll try to do my best to entertain your question. This, of course, is op-ed. These are my opinions, but I think that some research can back up what I'm going to say. I think the bottom line, though, is that people don't find Christianity to be relevant to their lives. I think that they look at the Bible as a book instead of looking at it as a library. I think that they look at it as look at the Bible as a collection of stories about things that don't matter.
Yeah.
They read it, it's famous. Like I'm going to sit down and read the Bible. And so you start with Genesis and then you get to Leviticus, you get halfway through Leviticus and it's over because you read that and you're like, what does this even mean? And I think that's a very common thing is that people sit and try to read this and then they come to this conclusion that this stuff just doesn't mean anything to me. So I think that that's a big problem is they just don't find it to be relevant at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I see that as well. People, they have a vision for their life, I guess, that, the Bible's this nice book that, it's got some nice things to say, but it's no different than the Quran or than any of the other religious texts or philosophy texts that have really kind of helped man try to figure out what mankind's out about. But Christianity's got kind of a very different approach and outlook on life, I guess, than some of those other world religions.
No question.
As well. So, tell me though about the nuns specifically. Like, what's that referring to when we classify it that way?
Yeah. So the nuns, that is a group where they claim to have no religion. There's no religious affiliation at all. Some of it's atheism, some of it's agnosticism, but I would say that it's actually not completely in that realm. I think they actually just don't find it relevant. There may or may not be a God, but at the end, who cares? I think that's what is kind of, centering up what a nun is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been thinking about this a lot too, right? This, I was driving home from Big Bear the other weekend from the mountains, and I just had this thought.
I miss Big Bear.
I know. It's actually fairly open, which is pretty cool. But yeah, the mountainous regions of Ohio aren't as grand, I guess.
I don't know. There's some good hiking out here, man.
Yeah, it's beautiful out there. I see pictures all the time, so I got to come visit you still. So this idea, this contrast of just kind of how people see religion versus seeing just kind of like secular society, right? And it's almost like religion, when they think about this idea of religion, they think about institutional religion, so to speak, right? As opposed to what flows from religion in a sense, which is kind of a set of beliefs, a set of truth claims that, have a bearing on how you think, how you perceive the world, and things like that. Obviously, that's a very practical implication of religion. But it seems to me that there's this resistance to obviously any kind or any form of institutional religion. What do you think is so attractive about not being affiliated with any kind of religion? Why do we see that number increasing over time?
Yeah. So, in preparing for this segment here, I had to do a little bit of research, and I found a really interesting catechism passage. And so I wanted to share that, Catechism of the Catholic Church. And here's what it says. It says, to adore God is to acknowledge in respect and absolute submission the nothingness of the creature who would not exist but for God. To adore God is to praise and exalt him and to humble oneself. And so I saw that passage and I started thinking, what is the problem here? And the problem, maybe to me, it sounds like we just like our independence too much. And, we like not having to answer to anyone. We don't want to submit. The catechism says you have to submit to God. We don't want to submit. Who wants to be humbled? I mean, honestly, who likes being humbled? Yeah. It's necessary for being able to improve as a human being and as a Christian, but who really wants that? And, I think the people who are focused more on being Christian, they understand the place of humility, and those who aren't, don't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I see with a lot of a lot of the self-help books, right, that are not
Mm,
religiously affiliated, you see them hit on that a lot of those tones, right? The tone of
mm,
humility, the tone of servanthood, that these things emerge, and people, in one sense, they look at these self-help books and they're like, yes, this person gets it. But it's like, it's a secular book. It's got zero to do with religion, but there's so much crossover. And yet we're still so resistant to this religious idea of being affiliated with a religion. Do you have any kind of thought that there maybe is a conception that people believe or want Christianity to address something that it's not currently addressing in their eyes? What would you say?
well, I guess it kind of depends on what they're searching for.
Yeah.
You know, non-Christians think that they know what they need to be happy. As a Catholic, I'm a firm believer that the way to be happy is to understand our end, and our end, of course, is going to be with God. Like when we die, our end is to be with God. And so, you have this group that says, I don't need that. I don't believe in that. And so I know what's going to make me happy. But the problem is we have this whole sector of people walking around and they're just miserable.
Yeah.
They might say that they're happy, but I'm not buying it, not for 1 second. And, I think that we have to redirect to the end goal of what humanity even is about. And, like I said, happiness, according to Thomas Aquinas, has to do with being directed towards our proper end, which is God. And I think people, honestly, I think that they confuse happiness with enjoyment. And so, I think we need to kind of break that down a little bit. Okay, well, happiness and enjoyment, what's the difference there? Enjoyment is a satisfaction according to earthly desires. Okay, so, but those things, they cannot sustain happiness. You always hear this, like money, things, cars, food. That's temporary. That's not eternal happiness. That's not something that's going to make me happy 20 years down the road after I eat a burger today.
Yeah. It's almost this attachment to earthly things, right? Or earthly desires. We become a slave to our impulses.
In a way.
A bit. And it seems still that that's attractive to some people, or maybe it's just something that's promulgated by obviously society and culture. It's like, you got to have keeping up with the Joneses mentality, right? You got to have this, you got to have the fast car, you got to have the big house, you got to have the smoking hot wife, right? It's like, yeah. And you're always pushing and grabbing and grasping at something that you think is ultimately going to fulfill this emptiness. And from your perspective, like, why is that never successful for people?
This might not be precise language, but I think part of it could be just it develops into this addiction. We know that food addiction's a real thing. Like, that's a real thing. And so, you eat that, whatever, you eat that hamburger, right? And, wow, man, I feel really good. And then 5 minutes later,
yeah.
Do you still feel good because you ate that hamburger? I'm not trying to knock I love hamburgers. So I'm not like, I like a hamburger just as much as the next guy.
Yeah.
But, it becomes this, I have to constantly do that thing in order to feel fulfilled. And it's just this rapid decline. Same thing with like the car or the quote unquote hot wife. Got that one, by the way.
Me too.
We're lucky guys. But, you have that car and it's like, great. Yeah, you can go down the road and you can burn it at 90 miles an hour. But great, good for you.
Yeah.
That's fun. That's a rush. But like in the end, what's that car serving? Really what it serves is to get you from your house to your work, get you from your work to a doctor's appointment. That's all it serves. It doesn't serve anything bigger than just this utility.
Yeah. There was in the Pew Research study, there was some interesting stuff that they did too about like why people were leaving. And it's just popping into my head here about this. I want to see if I can find it pretty quickly. But the reasons were interesting. Some of the reasons, for example, were people that were leaving because they just didn't believe what the church taught. Some people left because, we don't like the church leaders of any particular religion. This could be anything. Christianity in particular. We just don't like, the people. And it seems like for a for a reason to deny why why you shouldn't be Christian or you shouldn't be Muslim is because you just don't like someone. Seems like such an odd thing to do. So why do you think those are some of the primary reasons? And is there something that the nuns who are leaving because of those reasons are missing? What would you say in a conversation to somebody like that?
That's an interesting point, and I think that there's something to that. You would hear about criticism of church leadership, or you can even take a criticism of the leadership of America, for instance. Yeah. It's easy to criticize these visible people, but in the end, I'm not an American because of who my president is. I'm an American because this is where I was born. Yeah. This is where I've got my citizenship. Not that that's necessarily the same with regard to the church. It's a lot easier to leave the church, I guess, than it is to leave America. But I guess in a way. But at the same time, like there's this visual thing. There's this expectation that it's a church and they better be refined. And I actually understand that. There's a lot of pressure working for the church. There's a lot of pressure. You go out there and people know you work for the church. You better make sure that you got your behaviors in check. And I don't always have my behavior in check, but I'm very conscious when I don't. And it's like, oh, right. Yeah, that's, first of all, not very Christ-like. Second of all, not a great representation for the church. Yeah. And those kind of things really do turn people off. I think there's something to say about that. But I would take that back. Yeah. And I would say, you're not a Catholic or a Christian because of your priest or minister. You're a Catholic or a Christian because of Jesus. Yeah. And then, I would even extrapolate that a little more and say, I think another big problem, backing up to your first question, I think another big problem that we've got is that we're not telling the story right at all. Like we're telling it and it just sounds boring. And, we're not even talking about like what Jesus was as a person. Mm-hmm. There's this ideal out there that, Jesus was a good man. He was a nice person. Oh, yeah. But he's not sold as someone who completely rocked everything about how you and I are on a fundamental level. We don't talk about him as someone who's an absolute rebel, a revolutionary. It's always like, well, that's just not very Jesus-like. And they want you to say, well, nice. And, one of my favorite priests out there, his name's Father John Ricardo, and he's got this quote, and I just love it. He says, Jesus was not nice. He was kind. He is loving. He's not nice. And so, I would look at us and say, are we teaching Jesus is nice? And if we are, that's a major disservice that goes against the story of Christianity in the first place. And then people hear this and they're like, why do I want to follow this nice guy? Like, that's fine to be nice, but there's nothing redeeming about just following some nice guy. Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. And I found this for the nuns who left their childhood faith, 49% left because they stated that they don't believe. They don't believe whatever the teachings are. And while these surveys are surveys, so they have to be given the credence. They're a sample set of a larger demographic, right? But sure. So there's still certain trends I think we can glean from it. And of that 49%, 36%, the largest percent, said they were disenchanted or they just don't believe. Looking inwardly, I guess, what do you think the church and laity and everybody's missing for that number to be so large? Yeah, I think it goes back to we're just not telling the story right at all. You talk about, well, here's this God figure that came and he died on the cross and he saved you. Yeah. And it's like, okay, cool. Great. But, if you just tell it like that, that is boring. That stinks. And, I would go back and say, we have a responsibility to reinvent the way that we're talking about this stuff. I think that we need to reinvent the way we are telling the story based on truth, of course, like not reinvent it. Sure. But we need to reinvent the way we're telling the story so that it's not boring. We need to, like, it's got to be like you're turning them on with this story. And I think it really boils down to, everyone knows the story of Adam and Eve. Even if you're non-Christian, I mean, you have the story of here's this Adam and Eve and they ate the apple. But, do people really understand why what Adam and Eve did mattered? Do they understand that what the devil did in Eden was so horrific? Like, do they even understand how horrific that was? And why did Jesus have to come and undo all that? We were being owned by evil, and the only cure for that was Jesus coming and letting us out of prison. But, we're not telling a story in a compelling way. We're not telling it in a way that people can relate to. And I think it really comes down to, you have this conflict with anyone, like get on social media, get on whatever. You have this conflict. What's the first thing someone's going to say to you when you disagree with them? It's, why are you being so judgmental? And then they'll say, I thought you were a Christian. Jesus said, don't judge. And it's like, dude, you just missed the whole point. Like, the passage has been corrupted. We don't even know how to respond. And as Christians, like, that's destructive too. Like, we don't even know how to respond to that charge. Like, don't be judgmental. Oh, okay. Sorry.
It's kind of interesting. It's kind of like a Christian apologist or somebody who like professionally stands up for the faith, right? For whatever their faith belief is, but they don't know the common objections. I've seen that literally, and somebody's like bashing some other religion, and then somebody throws an objection out. And they're like, "Oh yeah, where do you find that? I haven't." And it's like, that's the most common, basic objection that you're not even aware of that, and you're professional. Like, I think you're right. And the judgmental thing, like, why are you being so judgmental? Let's step back. It brings up a really interesting thing. This concept of relativism. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I think that's promulgating a lot of this. Broadly speaking, how would you define relativism?
Oh, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And, I said, people will say, why are you being so judgmental? I get that more often than not because I'm talking about this subject right here, relativism. Okay. The way that I would define relativism is you, Josh Smith, have a truth. I, Dave Brunsman, have a truth. It doesn't matter that we don't agree on that truth, because there's no such thing as an objective truth. And so, in a broadly speaking sense, that is how I would define it. But, I cannot get past this amazing quote that I think this was done before Pope Benedict was Pope Benedict. He was Ratzinger before he was the Pope. And he has this quote that says, relativism is a tyranny and a dictatorship which centers around one's ego and one's own desires. So that's not his direct quote, but like that's a paraphrase. He called it a tyranny and a dictatorship. Wow. And, have you ever heard that quote before?
I feel like I vaguely may have, but I haven't heard it in a while. It didn't ring a strong bell.
So I get the reason I'm asking. Now I'm the interviewer. The reason I'm asking is, have you ever thought about what the word dictatorship means?
I really haven't.
Or what the word tyranny means? Yeah. And, I think we have to take Pope Benedict's words here and really take heed on what he's saying. A dictatorship, I think that people think about a dictatorship and they think, oh, well, Castro, that was a dictatorship. But they don't really know what that means. Yeah. They're like, Castro, bad. Yeah. Dictatorship, bad. But they don't know what that means. And what it means is it's an absolute authority over something else. That's a dictatorship. And a tyranny is a cruel, unreasonable, and arbitrary control through power. And so, if you break that down back to relativism and you say relativism is a cruel, unreasonable, and arbitrary control through power, like, that sounds a lot more toxic than just using the word relativism.
Yeah, definitely. I think people try and, with the whole judgmental thing that you were talking about earlier too, there's this desire to make Jesus into this relativist, like he was just okay with everything, right? I was talking with somebody the other week, and the comment came out about, well, if Jesus was around today, what would he be okay or not be okay with? And it was surrounding the topic of the pro-choice conversation.
Sure.
And they were like, do you think that Jesus would be pro-choice today? And I was like, well, that's kind of an odd question. But no, I don't think he'd be pro-choice today. If Jesus is in fact God and God is the author of life and life was conceived, then why would he destroy what he created? That seems counter to the purpose, right? And so, but there's this idea out there that Jesus should be somehow relativized. What other ways have you seen this kind of relativism take over the culture today?
And see, isn't that kind of mentality just makes Jesus boring? Yeah. Like, what do you mean there's no right or wrong?
Yeah.
It's like the epitome of ego. You know, my own self-esteem, my own self-importance, and it's like the root of all of this is pride. All of it is pride. And so, you know, where is relativism in the culture? It's everywhere. It's all over the place. You know, you engage anyone in a serious conversation.
Yeah.
Engage anyone in a serious conversation for 10 minutes, and you're going to be accused of being judgmental if you tell someone that they're wrong about facts.
Sure.
And, you know, you're bringing up like the pro-choice thing. You're right. Like, God's going to condone destroying the very thing that he created? No, absolutely not. There's no chance that that's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like there's so many contradictory points to this. So you mentioned objective truth. Like, there is no objective truth in relativism.
Yeah.
Look, we don't have to belabor it. Like, I think there's a circular reason here, right? You know, there's this objective statement that there is no objective truth. And people can mince words all they want, but at the end of the day, that's literally the argument they're making. Like, we objectively know there's nothing objective, and there's something off about that, right? So,
I mean, it's circular reasoning.
It's circular at its finest. So if you think about that, though, why do people struggle so much to even grasp that concept when we can point to things as objective? Like, the wall behind me is blue. Now, somebody who's colorblind might disagree with me. You know, so there's still this subjectivity of like, well, to each his own. You know, in your mind it was right, in my mind it was wrong, but that's okay, right? Like, it's fine. Why is there still such a resistance to any kind of level of objective reasoning or objective truth when it comes to matters of faith and other issues in society?
Yeah, honestly, I think it goes back to pride. It goes back to that, you know, we don't want to be told what to do.
Yeah.
We don't want to be told what to think. We don't, you know, like, I don't want to humble myself.
Yeah.
And, you know, being humbled, sometimes it can be challenging to be humbled.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not always right, and neither are you.
Yeah.
And actually, I'd say I'm more wrong than right. But, you know, who likes being told that they're wrong? But then, you know, you tell someone that they're wrong, they dig in their heels and they say, no, I'm right, regardless of facts, regardless of evidence.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it just all boils back down to pride.
Yeah. Where do you think we see relativism on fullest display today?
Yeah, I think the fullest display, there's a couple of tiers here, but I think the fullest display, I think, is going to be within the realm of agnosticism and atheism. That's I'd say that's like the very broad umbrella. I don't mean to pick on this group at all, but, you know, secondarily, I think that there is a good amount of relativism hanging around in Protestant circles, non-Catholic circles, because, you know, really, what is the seed of the non-Catholic Church in the first place? They left because, I don't believe in that truth. And so, you know, again, like, I don't mean to pick on non-Catholics. That's my job. I love non-Catholics. You know, I love engaging them and conversing with them, growing in friendship, whether they convert or not. I mean, you got to still try to be friendly with people, regardless of where they're coming from.
Sure.
But then, you know, finally, I would say where we see this in a major way is just within Christianity in general. There's this huge push where those who believe that all other religions are equal, even in Christianity, you know, they'll say, well, you know, you're Hindu, that's fine. And I don't mean to pick on Hindu or Islam or whatever. You know, that's great that you're Muslim. All religions are the same. We're all going to the same place. And it's like, but they're not equal at all. Like, they're not even close to equal. And there's this idea, you know, you see that sticker on a car, it says coexist. You know, there's this ideal of tolerance that just doesn't make sense. You know, should we be tolerant? Yes, absolutely. We need to be tolerant, but not at the expense of the truth. And, so I think that we are pushing this tolerant ideal, but at the expense of truth. And, I think where that comes in full focus is out there on social media and things like that. The media just in general, like you can't even turn the television on and look at the news without getting some kind of bias. And, what's the purpose of the media? The media is to tell you the facts so that you can figure out what's going on. But there's just this bias all over the place. And so it's at the expense of truth. It's just everywhere. Not to get into like this big political discussion at all. I really don't want to get into that. But look at President Trump's campaign against what he called fake news. Okay. And I would break that down and say, he might be right. I don't know. I don't work in the news. He might be right. We don't know because it all seems to be fake. And that's a huge problem. And so no one even knows the truth. Things that are blatant lies are being sold as truth. And then people buy it, they distribute it, and the cycle continues.
Yeah. And there's almost this bland, this is so interesting. We're in a very tumultuous time. So at the time of this recording, we're in the midst of the Trump-Biden election, for those who are watching this years down the road. And it's a pretty tumultuous time right now because you have so many people on the left and the right. But I want to pull out a specific idea that I've seen kind of promulgated around this time, right? There's this whole segment of people that are saying, hey, we need to learn how to have a conversation and be okay disagreeing with each other, right? And then there's this, and where in the past that may have satisfied a conversation, right, of disagreement. But it seems now almost there's a denial of that. Like you're not even allowed to do that. You're not even allowed to disagree charitably because people have this idea that somebody's rights are being impinged on, right? Or their idea of rights. I know we'll get into the conversation of rights at a different time, but we live in, it's so interesting because it's like, while we live in a relativistic culture and society where your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, there's this whole kind of wave that it seems to be sweeping through at least American culture, this whole wave sweeping through the culture of, well, no, it's not okay for your truth to be your truth and my truth to be my truth. So it's almost, well, on the one hand, you have the Christian truth, right? And then Christians leave Christianity because they're in favor of my truth, right? But then there's almost this surgence of people that are not okay even now with, it's okay for you to have your truth and your perspective and me to have my truth and my perspective, but we could still kind of get along. It's now all of a sudden it's not acceptable to accept anything aside from what somebody believes to be true. I don't know if you've seen that as well, but it's such an interesting observation that I've seen, especially in the midst of a lot of the political landscape right now.
Sure. Yeah. I think we just need to refocus the way that we communicate. Are we all going to agree? No, we're not all going to agree. Like that's a fact of human nature. Yeah. But we have to keep the dialogue open. Right now we've got this push to just, I don't like what you're saying. Unfriend, block.
Yeah.
What good does that do? Like that doesn't. First of all, that doesn't develop you as a human being. That doesn't develop our relationship. What's the purpose of unfriend, block?
Yeah.
We have to be able to keep those communications open. And the purpose of dialogue in the first place is to get to the deeper truth. Like that's the point. And we have to be humble enough to say, you know what, I could be wrong here. I very well could be wrong here. But we have to look at it with some sort of objectivity and figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. Well, Dave, I'm going to take a quick minute to definitely plug for everybody who's watching this podcast right now. Definitely hit the like button and give that subscribe button a little pound so you can continue to get more of the awesome content getting pumped out by the Practical Theism podcast. We're going to continue to drive this for you. And if you're a frequent listener, you've heard several of the episodes so far, consider subscribing not only to the YouTube channel, but also the podcast platform, and leave some reviews on iTunes. That definitely helps the podcast circulate, gets more people to watch and listen to all the guests that are coming on the show. It definitely helps us out, and we can continue to pump out more content and get even more people on the podcast. So we thank you for that. The next kind of question I want to dive into, you touched on it a little bit when you were diving into, people believing different religions are kind of equal, right? And yet there's this, this idea that, well, no, they're not equal. There's in Catholic Church says that, well, they have this idea of the fullness of truth, right? And other religions would be argued like, oh, there's slivers of truth there. I wanted to dive into that just a little bit. I know there's probably a big topic there, but what do you say to somebody who's like, well, how can you say you have the truth and there's no other truth? I know this is kind of a left curveball, but just popped in my head. How would you answer that?
Well, I guess the first thing that we have to do is we have to go back. Okay, so take any faith tradition that you want to look at, and you say, who founded your faith tradition? And here's the beautiful thing about Christianity over any other faith tradition is that Christianity claims to have been founded literally by God. Literally by God. Like he came to earth, he came to earth and died for us and made this religion. No other religion can say that. You can't look at Hindu, you can't look at Islam, you can't look at Buddhist and say that God founded that religion at all. And so, one, we have to trace that back. And then, but then you do have a burden of proof. You have to say, okay, this is your claim. Fine, I'll entertain your claim, but let's explore that a little bit more. But again, you have to put the objectivity on the table and look at it for the objective truth that's being pitched. It can't just be written off just simply, but you cannot refute at all who established Islam. It cannot be refuted. You cannot refute who established Buddhism. And neither of them were God. And I think that there's a big push to in this trying to equate all the religions with each other. They really are not the same at all, because Christianity, the thing about Christianity which makes it so unique, aside from that it was established literally by God, it puts God in heaven as this father figure. And I think that that's actually something that's really important to consider, because if you look at today's culture, I mean, what's one of the huge gripes that you're going to hear about kids in today's culture is this fatherless society, right? And so we don't even have good relationships with our fathers. But they hear this, well, God's this father figure in heaven, and it doesn't even make sense to them because they don't even understand what that means on earth. But, here we have this figure, this father figure that's supposed to care for us and love us unconditionally. That's so far different than any other religion that you're going to run into.
There's so much to dive into, but more for another episode. We'll transition on this, though, on a hinge a little bit here, given some of your background in your journey and your wife's journey, actually. So this probably hits home a little bit. We've seen, obviously, a heavy move in America in particular towards Protestantism, or this non-Catholic style of Christianity. So what, and we saw it in the Pew Research study, too, the numbers that we were talking about earlier. There seems to be, in America, a larger percentage of U.S. adults that identify with some form or flavor of non-Catholic Christianity or Protestantism. So what is Protestantism, and why do you think some Christians have really leaned towards that?
That definitely hits home for me. I mean, that's like pulling on my heartstrings right there, Josh. No question. I would need to preface anything that I'm saying about this one with this. And what I would preface is that I have a lot of Protestants in my family. My wife is a convert from the Methodist tradition, so non-Catholic. I love Protestants. I wouldn't be able to have my job if I didn't love Protestants. My job, RCIA, is bringing non-Catholics, which could be Protestants or not, into the Catholic Church. That's my job. I can't have my job unless I have a deep love and respect for them. So, Protestantism, I think the big appeal, I don't mean this to be divisive,
Sure.
but I understand how it could be. I think the big appeal is that it just doesn't demand as much as the Catholic Church demands. And also, I think that because it's not so worldwide visible, I don't think it's as scandalized as the Catholic Church. And that probably just has to do with the visibility of
Sure.
each individual denomination, or like an independent branch of non-Catholic Christianity, like an evangelical independent. They're not as visible as the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church's got 1.2 billion followers,
Yeah.
thousands, hundreds of thousands of priests.
Yeah.
But I think that to talk about Protestantism, we have to kind of back up and get our terminologies right. And so, there's this word that gets floating around. It's called denomination. And they'll look at Catholics and they'll say, well, you're just one of the denominations. What's your denomination? Catholicism. That's not even factually, that word is not
Sure.
being used correctly. Denomination is Protestantism. Protestantism, if you break it down, it's protesters of the Catholic Church. That's what it means.
Yeah.
And you're breaking down that. And so the problem is that when you're talking to non-Catholics, particularly non-Catholic Christians, and you start talking about this, it can be offensive. Language can be offensive. Sure. Which is why I really do try to not use the word Protestantism. I try to use non-Catholic Christians instead. It says the same thing, but it still also gets back to what Vatican II was trying to explain, that through the virtue of our baptism, we are still brothers and sisters in Christ. Yeah. And that is true. And we need to celebrate that. We need to understand that that's the case. So I try to use non-Catholic Christians instead of Protestantism. Yeah. But denomination, it's a Latin word. What it means is calling by anything other than the proper name. Okay.
Interesting.
And so if you break that down, denomination, D is of, like D means of.
Yeah.
Nomination, another name. So Catholicism in Christianity, Catholicism is Christianity, and Christianity is Catholicism. Protestants, by definition, are denominations, and so we have to get that language right when we're trying to meet them where they are. The Catholic Church is the original denomination, and is this semantics? You have this conversation, and they're going to say, well, you're getting bogged down with semantics, and I would say the entire study of theology is semantics. Yeah. And then they'll say, well, that's just a lot of rhetoric, and it's like, well. Fine, but rhetoric is not a bad thing. Yeah. That's something you can study. It's an actual topic. Yeah. So
as one non-Catholic Christian told me once, words have meanings. So
they do.
It's important to pay attention to them.
I think we need to take heed on that advice.
Yeah. So getting back to that, now that we got it kind of squared up and defined, why do you think there's this tendency to kind of lean towards that as opposed to Catholicism? I know you mentioned that it doesn't require as much, so potentially, people when they need more, it can't satisfy it. That might be a cause for a move from it or to maybe Catholicism or something. Is there anything else that you see as reasons why people may potentially want to go with a denomination, as you put it, as opposed to Catholic Christianity? And for those who may not be aware of where the term Catholic comes from, maybe you could share a little bit about where that comes from too.
Sure. Catholic, the word Catholic is ancient. I mean, that's back in I'm going to get the reference wrong, but I think it's St. Ignatius back in 100 AD, something around there. He said, where the Catholic Church is found. He used the phrase where the Catholic Church is found. So he's the one that first originally coined that term. Yeah. What the word means, Catholic, it just means universal. Yeah. That's all it means. And that's why it's not a denomination. Catholic, meaning that the truth is universal and appealing to everyone. Yeah. If you look into it, it's that's why that word is so charged. But getting back to your question though, I do stand by that non-Catholic Christian denominations, they don't demand as much. And actually I do have some evidence for that. Okay. When I first meet a non-Catholic, when they walk into my office and they say, hey, my wife's dragging me into here and wants me to be Catholic, That happens so. I mean, that's what happened to my wife. I dragged her in there, and it was through her own decision that she joined. But I was definitely the catalyst. There's no question about it. So when someone walks into my office and says, "Hey, I'm looking into the Catholic faith," and you kind of dive into this, one of the big objections that you get is, "What's up with all the rules?" And I think that really does speak back to that. Other denominations don't demand as much. And, and we're talking on the surface, simple demands. Sure. But when you really dig into them, they're big demands. I mean, these are big life-changing decisions. And, we shouldn't get into this right now, but, you take, for instance, like the Catholic Church teaching on the use of contraception. You're not going to find any non-Catholic denomination except for like some random, really far out there sect who has a teaching like that. But they look at the Catholic Church and they say, well, that's just one of those rules, and I just don't want to follow that rule.
Yeah. Just speaking of rules and the demand that Catholic Church specifically puts on people, what would you say is that demand, and why do you think people are resistant to that demand?
I think the demand is that they want you to live to your fullest self. Honestly, I think the Catholic Church has in place this system that helps you live to your fullest self. But in our culture, in our, where we live, it's, I know how to live to my fullest self. And so I don't need someone to tell me how to do that. But, again, like go back to the research that's being looked at here. We have depression is through the roof, suicides through the roof. People don't know how to make themselves happy, and the reason is because they're not looking here, they're looking here, like they're looking in. And you have to look outside of yourself in order to be happy. Like looking in at yourself, that's not how you're going to find happiness.
Yeah.
And so the church, they're constantly trying to get you to look outward and upward. Really look upward.
Yeah.
But a lot of that, going back to like obedience, going back to submission, going back to humility, you tell anyone that they need to be obedient. Nah, no thanks. I don't want to be obedient.
Yeah, not today.
No, and why? It's because it's hard.
Yeah. What are some of those tough topics that the church talks about? I know you mentioned contraception. Yeah. Maybe we could just take a look at 2 or 3 that are, the demands of the church and why they are what they are. It might be helpful for those to understand, people to understand those.
Sure. Yeah. I think, we kind of are in this mentality where you're coming up with this question is you're going to hear so many times, the church just needs to adjust with the times. Right?
Oh yeah.
The church needs to get with the times. And, the problem with that claim is the church is supposed to be a guide for moral matters, and morality is timeless and doesn't change. And so getting with the times, like, they are with the times because morality doesn't change. And so, you're bringing up these like tough topics. You're asking about these tough topics, and, you can list hundreds of these things. Sure. But the get with the times is, what is it? Women priests. Why can't we have women priests? Homosexual marriage, contraception, abortion, in vitro fertilization. And, I was kind of thinking about this question, and, when we just had the most recent Supreme Court nomination, got seated, and then there's this whole slew of people sitting around the outside of the Supreme Court in the Handmaid's Tale outfit. And they think that this is how it is, like this real oppressive entity. And Catholicism is anything but oppressive. It is not oppressive. You can take this even back, what was this, probably 15 years ago, maybe, that book, The Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, I remember.
Came out with Dan Brown.
Yeah.
That was a frenzy. And people read this thing, and they actually believe that what that author had to say about Catholicism is true. And it's total nonsense.
Yeah.
And so, people see these stories, and they, you bring up women priests, gay marriage, contraception, abortion, in vitro fertilization, all these other things. And people see these stories and they assume oppression. They say the church needs to change.
Yeah.
And the problem is with every one of these pitches, women priests, gay marriage, contraception, in vitro fertilization, abortion, among others, they can't change. It's an impossibility. The church is never, they will never endorse any of that stuff. And the reason is because the church is founded on perfectly good teaching and doctrine.
Yeah.
And, I think people have a big problem. They look at these things and they are blind to their desires versus wanting to bend their desires to God's will.
Yeah. That's a great line. Keep that. Do you think the church does a good job communicating on these tough topics to people? Where do you think the church can improve, if not?
No, actually I don't. I don't think that they do a good job talking about it at all. And I think that the reason that they don't do a good job, I think part of it, we kind of get stuck in this bureaucratic mindset that, you just go to the catechism. But the problem is like, man, you go to the catechism. If you don't know how to read the catechism, that sucker can be majorly offensive. Yeah. And so do we do a good job communicating? Yeah, because the information's there in papal writings, the catechism, you can find the information. Sure. But people don't want to read it for themselves. But then no, because the workforce of the church, so like the priests, the lay leaders, the parishioners, we're getting better, but we don't do a good job. We can do such a better job of, I think the delinquency that we're having here is that we're using language, but we're not using precise enough language. So, for instance, like let's break that down for just a second. Yeah. For instance, like with the contraception issue, you can tell someone, well, the church doesn't approve of contraception, and then they're gonna tell you to buzz off and get out of my face. I don't want to hear that. Yeah. But if you really sit down with someone and like, hey, let's have a conversation about this. And let's talk about what does the church actually teach on contraception. Talk about the purpose of intercourse in the first place. There's this unitive and procreative purpose of intercourse, okay? And if you remove one of them, the purpose, like the end, as Thomas Aquinas would talk about it, the end isn't there. And so, but then talk about the definition of marital love. And so, one of the big things that my wife and I, in terms of ministry work, one of the big things we're into is teaching about the teaching on contraception. So I mean, I can go on for hours and hours on this, but things I would like to break down about this is the definition of marital love. I think this is so important, and the church does a good job of communicating it only if you know how to find it. And so marital love has to be life-giving. It's got to be permanent. It's got to be a self-gift. It's got to be based on knowledge, and it's got to be a choice. Yeah. Okay? Now, if you take all 5 of those definitions, and like, let's say that you remove one. Let's say that you remove self-gift from that list of 5 to make those 5 create marital love, and you remove self-gift. What do you have? What you have is rape. Like, I'm not giving you myself, you're taking it. Yeah. And so if you can break down the church definition of marital love, talk about like based on knowledge, take based on knowledge out. If you take that out of the definition of marital love, what you have is pedophilia. And I don't mean to be like gross and controversial here, but that's what it is. Like kids don't understand. And so based on knowledge, if you remove that, and what that means that you're putting someone in there that doesn't have the knowledge about what intercourse is in the first place, that's pedophilia. And so if you sit down and you break this down, I think that there's a way to communicate this. Talk about what makes love so great. One of my favorites, I've been studying him so much recently, I'll always go back to him, but Thomas Aquinas, he has this great definition of love, and it's in his Summa. And what he says is, love is willing the good of another. And I think that that's such a great point because love is not about me, Josh. Love is not about you. It's about like you love your wife. What are you going to do to will the good for your wife?
Yeah. I love that definition.
And me too. And I think one other thing, I think that we should probably, at least talk about this one thing here, if you don't mind, is, another tough topic is homosexuality. That is such a hot button issue. And, the church, again, like they have the teaching, it's just that it's just not being communicated right.
Sure.
So I'd like to take just a moment to try to communicate
Break
that
it
right.
down.
Cool. Great. So when someone comes up to me, and I work with a good amount of homosexuals, believe it or not, like they come to me and they say, that I don't feel welcome in the church. And I say, hold on, you should definitely feel welcome in our church. Our church is for everybody. And so I'll pull out the catechism and paragraph 2358 in our catechism. Here's what it says. And we're going to break this definition down. Okay. It says, the number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. And so you know what that means right there? When someone claims that the Catholic Church doesn't acknowledge homosexuality, wrong. They are saying right there that the church knows it exists. They are admitting that it exists right there in the catechism. The definition goes on and it says, this inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial. And I think that's where you lose people right there. They look at the phrase objectively disordered and they're lost. And what that means versus what they think it means. Sure. What objectively disordered means is you're talking about objective truth. So there is such thing as a truth, a real truth. But then disordered, all that means is contrary to the natural order of things. And so if you look at homosexuality, again, not without being too graphic, but you have like a male and a male. Their quote unquote union, that is contrary to the natural order, because you can look at a male body and understand that does not fit. Like it's not designed in that way. And so according to the natural order, the way that things are in the world, that's contrary to the order, and that's what disordered means. And they look at disordered and they're like, what, you're telling me there's something wrong with me? No.
Yeah.
No, we're saying that the behavior that's happening here is against nature. And, but the church even recognizes that this inclination, it constitutes for most of them a trial. But here's the thing that no one reads. They look at that sentence and they stop. It goes on and it says, they must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. And I think that that's just so great. If you look at that, look at the word unjust. What does unjust mean? It means you're requiring someone to cooperate in a morally evil act. Okay? Unjust discrimination, that doesn't mean that they can't come worship with you. Not at all. Like, no, they should absolutely be able to come worship with you. Everyone is welcome in the Catholic Church. Regardless of what other people might believe, everyone's welcome in the Catholic Church. Yeah. And, I think people read that explanation about homosexuality, they're offended because they're not looking at the world for what it really is. And, I think you and I kind of talked about this a little bit. There's this phrase, like, I have this right to marry, for instance. And the problem is marriage is not a right. Yeah. Marriage is not a right. I don't have a right to be married, even though I'm not homosexual. I don't have a right to be married. I have to find someone, court that person for a little bit. Yeah. And then I have to say, hey, do you want to get married? But that's not the end of it. She has to also say, sure, I'll be married. If I had a right to be married, I can just go take her. Yeah.
Just talk about that a little bit, this concept of rights, because it was something that we were having a conversation about. Can you elaborate on that? This concept of rights and how it's perceived in the, I guess, public sphere, social sphere.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the conversation about rights has been going on for a very long time. Since well before I was born. I was born in the 70s. But in my lifetime, the way that rights have been kind of discussed has been, for instance, you look back, what was it, 5 or 6 years by now, the Obergefell and Hodges decision by the Supreme Court. You have these slogans, and the slogans are like, love wins, love is love. Well, no, it's actually not. Love is not love. Like, there's so many different kinds of love. Like, I love my wife in a different way than I love my kids, in a different way than I love this car, in a different way than I love my mom and dad, in a different way than I love food, in a different way than I love sister. right? And then, of course, in a different way than I love God.
Yeah.
They're all different. So, when you're trying to simplify this, like this English definition of love is love. No, it actually is not. Like it's a very, very deep meaning with transcendent consequence. And, they're trying to simplify what they are actually saying without saying it is that I can have sex with whoever I want wins.
Mm-hmm.
They're not saying love wins. They're saying I get to have sex with whoever I want, and that wins.
Yeah.
And that's a legal matter, and that's what they're calling love.
Yeah.
The problem is that sex is not love. Mm-hmm. It's not. And, they're advocating for the permanence of love to be redefined. And that's just not legally, that's not even a possibility. The problem is, though, like, let's talk about like this, the gay rights marriage.
Sure.
Let's break that down a little bit more. The main thing is no one was telling homosexuals that they could not have sex with someone. No one was saying that. Now, 50 years ago, they might have been saying that. Okay. But no one was saying to a homosexual, you can't go have sex with that other person. Like, no one's going into your bedroom saying you can't have sex with that person. Factually, though, homosexuals have a body and they're free to do with that body whatever they wish. Mm-hmm. And that can be for moral purposes or amoral purposes. Yeah. And, I can't control you any more than you can control me, any more than I can control my neighbor.
Yeah.
And so, they were saying that homosexual sex, not homosexuality, they were saying that homosexual sex is unnatural and that they shouldn't be doing it. That was what the argument was. I think that there was so much offense being strewn around with that issue that, no one was saying that that homosexual sex, like, you couldn't have it. They were just saying that it's amoral. But again, like, back up to the my truth, your truth, back up to the, like, I don't want to be obedient to something else. Who wants to be told that they're doing something immoral?
Yeah.
Not me. I can tell you that, right? Yeah. I don't want to be told I'm doing something immoral.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and this idea of rights is always interesting because it's, just like you suggested, you have this right to do something, and it's interesting. You made the comment that, well, they believe it's the what they're really saying is that I get to have sex with whoever I want. But it's like, by that very definition, if you take that to the logical conclusion, it goes above and beyond the issue that they're trying to tackle, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of the things I've always been pondering about, especially lately, where it's like, okay, and this is something I got to check myself with too. And everybody's got to check themselves with when they're trying to purport any kind of claim of anything. And it's a constant struggle and a constant battle, but it is whatever I'm stating is potentially objectively true. And this goes for somebody who maybe is staking a claim that is for pro-choice or for gay marriage or something like that. Are you consistent with that across the board? So if it's objectively true that people can have sex with whoever they want, then technically affairs should be okay. Like, I should be able to have sex with whoever I want, even if I'm married. Who cares? I should be able to have sex with animals. I should be able to have sex with kids. Like, there's so many other implications to the redefinition that it seems like on the surface maybe are not being considered. I don't know if you see that as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's the case. As a matter of fact, when Obergefell was handed down, I mean, before it was handed down, if you were hanging around in Christian circles, that's exactly what they were talking about. They were saying, well, if this thing falls and now we're redefining marriage, what says that I can't have 2 wives or 7 wives? Or what says that I can't marry my sister? Or what says that I can't marry my house? And I think that there was even, I could be wrong about this, but I think that there was even a case somewhere up in the Northwest, somewhere around there, this person who was trying to marry their dog or something like that. And it's like, that just doesn't even make sense. But like, this is the logical conclusion of what this push is. And again, like, it completely denies what marital love is in the first place. And we have to get back to the definition of what marital love is in order to even be able to plead the case. And it's all semantics, all of it.
Yeah. Man, there's so much to dive into there. It will definitely have to have a circle back on some of those conversation topics. That'd be great. But let's jump back in to get to the rub here. How how do Christians properly go about bringing people back to Christianity? So we talked about a bunch of the issues of things that potentially are driving people away, why people are leaving Christianity. From your perspective, how do Christians themselves, the people who want this inclusive property of religion and of their faith to expand across the globe, how do they go about bringing people back to the Christian faith?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we've got to do is we have to be a lot more careful about the language we use. You know, when people criticize and they say, well, you know, that's just semantics. Oh, you better believe it is. And, you know, that precise language, that means everything. And so, you know, you have to be really careful to not just throw out claims that aren't true. You have to really think about these claims, and, you know, don't get so bogged down with someone challenges you and you have to respond right away. You might have to go home and think about that for a month before you can respond and say, you know what, I had to think about that so that I could give you an adequate response, not just something I fired off in an email or fired off in a phone conversation or whatever. So one is, I think we got to be really careful about the language that we use. I think the other thing is that we really have to be willing to engage in conversation in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, this whole like unfriend block, that's not good. If you're in that kind of mentality, like, you got to stop it.
Dave, before you move on, I want to pause on that for a minute, because I want to have you expand on that piece a little bit, just because of what's going on right now, right? There's the way conversation goes right now, whether like you're on, just to use political language, the left or the right side of the conversation, there's people on both sides that it seems are so resistant by their dictation on social media, their articulation in person. They're so resistant to even having the conversation. So maybe you can expand on that piece of engaging the conversation a little bit further to how do you go about doing that with people who seem so, and in some ways, so violently against that?
Yeah, you know, and I think that's such a good point. I think one of the big things that we've got to do is we have to be willing to engage in that conversation. You know, when someone throws something out there, engage it. And like, is it maybe going to hurt your feelings? Maybe, but you got to engage it. And, you know, when someone throws something out there like that, listen to what they're saying. Like, there is something behind the words that they're saying. They're not just like, here's the words, read them at face value. There's something behind that. And you can't get the behind meaning until you get to know them, until you engage them in a relationship. Listen before you speak, ask questions. You know, a great teaching tool is don't respond with a comment, respond with a question.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So true.
And, you know, okay, so fine. We have this political difference here, or moral difference or whatever. Respond with a question and make it thought-provoking, not this yes or no. Make it a thought-provoking question and be really smart about the way you communicate. You know, I think another thing, you know, politics or morality or whatever, you know, bringing it back to the Christian focus that, you know, that this podcast is about, you know, you might run into someone who says, well, you know, I went to Catholic school. I know what the church teaches. And when someone says that, they're oftentimes not Catholic, and they've probably been really badly hurt by something in their past that made them walk away. And, you know, what's more important, like winning the argument or listening and saying, you know, like diving deep in it and getting to the point and saying, you know, eventually, hopefully after a month or two of dialogue, what's the thing that really hurt you about this? Because I think that there's just so much pain out there in the world, not just in Christian circles. I think it's just everywhere. There's so much pain. If we can't engage with that pain, like, what the heck are we even doing?
Yeah.
And, you know, I really do believe this. I do believe this. People naturally have a desire to be better people.
Yeah.
You know, you're right. We have this crazy vitriol out there, but I do believe that everyone desires to be better. Like, you as a human being have a natural feeling that you're supposed to act in a certain way. And you either act in accord with that nature or you don't.
Yeah.
And I think that the only way that we can kind of like help to elevate each other is to engage in that conversation and try to, you know, pull each other along and, you know, pull me along. Like, I do all kinds of immoral things that I need people to like, hey, Dave, don't do that. And that's why I go to confession, thank goodness. Right? But
There you go.
but you got to have people to pull you along and get you in that mindset. And so anyway, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. No, that's great, Dave. I think that's a good way to wrap up this conversation on why people are leaving Christianity. So I want to thank you for all the thought-provoking things that you said, everything you were able to share, your experiences. Sounds like we have a lot more things that we need to talk about. And so we'll have to have you back very soon.
Cool. I do want to end on one other thing, if you don't mind, just real quick.
Yeah.
In religion in particular, not Christianity, just religion.
Sure.
It lives in the realm of philosophy. And when you work in that area, so I'm a professional in this area, but even when you're not a professional, like you're just trying to befriend someone and talk to them about the truth of Jesus Christ, right?
Sure.
I rarely will go quote the Bible. And the thing is that if they're not Christian, they don't care about the Bible.
Yeah.
And so appeal to their common sense, appeal to what makes them human, appeal to what you have in common, and then build from there. And I think that that's a great launching off point for starting a conversation when you're on just a vast, completely different side of things.
Absolutely. One of the most disarming things, I couldn't agree more. One of the most disarming things I've ever encountered when talking with anybody of any kind of religion when it comes to Christianity is the minute you say, hey, let's just put the Bible on a shelf for a minute.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about it. Let's talk about this. It's the most disarming thing. It's the minute you start opening the scripture, it's subject to critique and criticism. For quite honestly, for some people who, in most cases, they don't even believe what you believe about it. So you're already off on a rocky start. So I couldn't agree more. That's such good advice. Such good advice. Hey, Dave, well, this has been awesome. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you. Appreciate your time. And we'll definitely have you back soon.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate the time, man.
Yep. And for everybody listening, wherever you might be listening at, definitely stay tuned because we're actually going to have Dave back on the podcast shortly here to talk more about specifically, is Jesus relevant today? Which I think is a really, really powerful topic, something very relevant for today. So stay tuned. If you haven't already, hit subscribe, ring that little bell if you're on YouTube so you can continue to get more of this awesome content. And when his episode comes out, you'll get notified. Don't forget to leave us reviews on iTunes and wherever you're listening and engage in conversation in the comments below. That's what this is all about. Let's start up a conversation and dialogue. And until next time, from all of us here at the Practical Theism Podcast, talk to you soon. Thanks.